moderator, Barbara, to explain our agenda. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Barbara. Barbara Maco is the Vice President of the Sustainable Remediation Forum. Barbara supports private and public sector clients with projects focused on sustainable remediation, redevelopment, and renewable energy generation on impaired lands. At the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, she served as a Senior Remedial Project Manager and Greener Cleanup Coordinator and facilitated the first EPA Memorandums of Understanding with the military service. Her projects have included international and U.S. federal and state Superfund sites, brownfields, and military munitions response sites. Barbara served on the scientific committees for both the 3rd and 4th International Sustainable Remediation Forums. Barbara holds a BA in Ecological Systems and a Master's in Business Administration in Sustainable Management. Barbara co-leads SURF's technical initiative researching climate change and resilience within sustainable remediation. Will you take it away, Barbara, to tell us about our agenda?
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for joining us as we continue the discussion on climate change and resilience within remediation. On our first webinar, we summarized the threats to public health and environment by climate change impacts on contaminated sites, those that have already been remediated, and those still needing action. We looked at the legal and insurance implications of those threats. We also discussed how these threats are exacerbated by the growth of environmentally impaired lands globally. Today's agenda on the next slide. We'll get an introduction to EcoAdapt and SURF, and we're fortunate to have speakers, indeed leaders in their field, representing the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We'll give you a brief progress update on the SURF technical initiatives and invite your feedback and ideas. So tell us a bit about EcoAdapt for those who are new to your organization.
Thanks, Barbara, and Alex from EcoAdapt will quickly tell us about EcoAdapt and the National Adaptation Forum. Maybe she won't. I can jump in and do that then. My name is Lauren, and I am...
I'm sorry, and I was on mute, Lauren.
Oh, no problem. Go ahead, Alex.
I'll help you here. I'm sorry about that. So EcoAdapt is a nonprofit with the one real goal of moving climate adaptation forward. So we do that through 5 of our main programs. The State of Adaptation program, where we actually find out who is doing what on adaptation. The Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, where we share case studies, tools, networks, where we actually build the practitioner networks. The Awareness to Action program, where we actually help people start adapting by helping them through workshops and webinars. Through our adaptation consultations, when we actually help find out the information for others that do not have time to do so. And then finally, through the National Adaptation Forum. And here today, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew what the National Adaptation Forum is. It's actually 174 days away. It's right around the corner. It will take place in St. Paul, Minnesota. We're really excited to have St. Paul be a host city because there's a lot of great adaptation work being held in St. Paul. And it will take place May 9th through the 11th. For those that have not heard about the National Adaptation Forum, this is really an opportunity to gather the adaptation community to foster knowledge exchange, innovation for mutual support for a better tomorrow. And there's actually still opportunities to submit a proposal for the forum. We're now accepting oral presentations, posters, and tools. These are online tools that help folks adapt, and these are open until December 16th. So if you have not submitted a proposal to the National Adaptation Forum, really encourage you to do so at this time. And for more information, the website is www.nationaladaptationforum.org, and I hope to see everybody in St. Paul in May. Now more than ever, this is really important to continue those discussions with the upcoming administration change and some changes, especially on climate adaptation. So the forum will provide a really great place for us to share and continue our exchange and learning from each other. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Alex. And next we'll head over to Barbara to talk about SURF.
The Sustainable Remediation Forum, SURF, is celebrating their 10-year anniversary as a nonprofit, education-focused organization of volunteers. Our mission is to maximize the overall environmental, societal, and economic benefits from the cleanup and reuse of contaminated sites. And on the next slide, you'll see how SURF has grown over the last 10 years. We've been surfing around the world, and the newest SURF, formally, is from Japan. The SURFs communicate regularly. At our last biennial conference, we became a formal organization, the International Sustainable Remediation Alliance. We supported the development of an international sustainable remediation standard, and we share an interest in the climate change and resilience as part of sustainable land management. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Carlos Pachon of the US EPA. Carlos is an environmental protection agency based at the headquarters of EPA in Washington, D.C. For many years, and he's known internationally, leads a cross-agency effort to advance the U.S. EPA's principle for green remediation and climate change adaptation practices and cleanup programs. To this end, Carlos is privileged to collaborate with the 10 U.S. EPA regions and indeed with regulators around the world, implementing programs, cleanup programs, and Superfund and other programs. He's been with the U.S. EPA for 18 years and holds a BS in watershed sciences, an MS in environmental management, and an MBA. I'll go ahead and introduce our second EPA expert, since they'll be speaking in tandem. Dailey of the U.S. EPA has both on-the-ground experience as a remedial project manager and is now working in headquarters. She's a senior environmental scientist with the Office of Superfund Remediation and Technology, and co-leads development of the EPA's recently issued series of Superfund climate change adaptation technical fact sheets, in addition to climate change adaptation, and also works on groundwater issues and is the Superfund completions coordinator and the Superfund tribal coordinator. Anne worked for 20 years in the EPA Region 10 office and before joining EPA headquarters 4 years ago. Anne has a Bachelor of Science in Geology and a Master's of Science in Oceanography from the University of Washington. Carlos and Anne, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. Hello, everybody. Good morning. So I guess my name is Carlos Pachon, and I'm here with Anne. We're in the same room. We've got 20 minutes. We're going to a tag team on this one. So I'll cover the first few slides, hand it back to her, and then I'll close out. So I got started on this business of climate change adaptation a bit by, what do you call it, a misunderstanding maybe. Somebody asked me, hey, in the agency we're supposed to look at climate change adaptation and the implementation of our programs. You do climate change stuff in greener cleanups, don't you? Why don't you take care of it? And of course, climate change we were focusing on then is more on mitigation, so how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, that contributed to climate change. But, you know, that moved us into the sphere of climate change is happening, of course, which is a fact, and it is having impacts, so what do we need to do about it? So that's a bit what we will talk about today, be quite specific to the Superfund program, but some of the information is relevant to any other cleanup program. I recognize many of you may come from a broader climate change adaptation universe. In other words, it might be urban development, it might be infrastructure planning, or whatever it may be. But I think a lot of the lessons learned, regardless of why we're trying to understand how it impacts us and what to do about it, are pretty universal. So I'm going to test my slide navigation thing. Yep, there it worked. So up too far. Hold on. There. I couldn't see the buttons, and I'm navigating back. So as I get started, there are a few topics we're going to cover. First is, why are we looking at this? There's a few mandates, and there are some agency-wide efforts. So I want to cover those for you. then quickly go into some of the potential issues. Why do we care about climate change impacts in cleanup contaminated sites? So I'll do a really quick summary of what some of those may be and why we're looking at them. At that point, we move into, so what are we doing about it here in the Superfund program? And I'll hand that off to Ann. As you heard earlier, Ann has many years of experience as a remedial project manager, actually up in Region 10 in the Pacific Northwest. And right now she's in program management, the Superfund program management. So she has both those perspectives to offer to you. So she's going to cover that part. I'm going to give a quick summary of some of the two projects where we experience climate change related impacts and summarize what we found from those, and then point you to some key resources and some key points of what we're doing here. So we go into this first slide on background. We started off on this back in 2011 when the agency issued a policy statement on climate change adaptation and basically directed each of the program offices to develop a climate change adaptation implementation plan. So we got started right off the bat in 2011. And you might think, well, we're in 2016 now, it took you a while. Yeah, so maybe it's a little bit slow. But fortunately, the rate of change, climate change, is in geological terms, maybe really fast, but in our terms, it's still extremely slow. So I think we're doing well. We're preparing ourselves well and on time to address these impacts that are coming our way. A few more other things happened in the interim, specifically a couple of executive orders. That last one on the bottom of the page on federal flood risk management standard. I know there's a lot of talk about what's going to happen to executive orders with the new administration, but I trust that some of them just make so much sense that they'll stay put, and this is definitely one of them. So this is one of them that asks, where are we spending federal dollars on infrastructure and other projects, and how might those projects be affected by climate change impacts? So this one here, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, basically points out three protocols to identify and quantify potential impacts. One of them is this climate change, climate-informed science approach to evaluating potential impacts. So it's a means of doing a quantitative analysis of what the likelihood is of a system being impacted. The second is a straightforward freeboard, which is base flood elevation plus 2 to 3 feet, depending on the project, or simply go with a 500-year floodplain as your basis for designing your project. So that's pretty straightforward, and we don't have time to go into those today. But if you're not familiar with the executive order and you do work in the federal realm, it's actually not a bad read, and we have pointers to it on our climate change adaptation site, if you know, or you can just Google it. Anyway, so that's happening, and we're responding to that. Fortunately, the requirements are technical, and they're consistent with our authorities and requirements in CERCLA. So basically, we look at the long-term effect and permanence of our remedies when we select, design, build remedies. And obviously, this is a technical question we'd have to consider. In other words, is my remedy going to be here next year if it has such a lifespan? So it is consistent with our regulatory requirements and authorities. It's more a matter of technically how do we go about figuring out how climate change may impact our remedies. So let's go to the next slide. So this is, we're not going to discuss climate change. That's, as you know, a huge topic. But why are we talking about it here today in the realm of contaminated site cleanups? Well, mostly because we recognize there are potential climate change impacts on our remedies that we put in place to protect human health and the environment from exposure to contaminants. The impacts will vary depending on the location of the remedy, the type of the remedy, the duration of that remedy, et cetera. There's a whole series of parameters that will affect what that impact may be, and that's what we're trying to figure out. And we're trying to prepare our project managers to better factor those considerations into both remedy risk assessments, remedy selection, design and operation considerations. And that's what we're going to summarize for you today. So how did we go about figuring out where to start? And I'm clicking and nothing is happening, but I'm going to assume it's going to change in a couple of seconds. There we go. So a while back in 2011, did we go too far?
Yeah.
I still have, oh, yes, I went too far. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay there. Thank you. So back in 2011, we did this summary, this analysis of, where our sites are. And sorry, I'm trying to get my screen up. Excuse me a second here. And we found that quite a few of the MPL sites were either within 100, 500-year floodplains or within 1 or 1.5 meter sea level rise. So that's what all those dots are on the screen. We looked at it a little bit more closely, and we realized that there are several general categories of impacts. One of them might be just the cost of installing the system. So it might get washed out, and even if contaminants aren't remobilized, we have to rebuild those systems. The other is that, well, there might be situations where the climate change impacts may remobilize contaminants and open up in your exposure pathways. So that's basically what those bullets summarize on the right, and that's why we focused on some of those at first and came out with a series of fact sheets on climate change adaptation considerations for groundwater remedies, climate change adaptation considerations for landfills and containment remedies, and landfill considerations for sediment remedies, because they tend to be quite expensive themselves and are more prone to, especially the mobilization side. So we came out with those 3 fact sheets, but we're moving forward, and we've got a few more activities underway since those fact sheets were put out. Let's go to the next slide. So this is where we are now. In 2014, and Ann may have summarized this about when was the last, about 6 months ago, right?
In March.
March,
in
yes.
Pasadena.
So I'll be brief on this. If you're in Pasadena or listening, you heard of this, but I think it's important to recap. The agency has put out a, well, actually our office within the agency put out a climate change adaptation implementation plan. The agency as a whole, there are actually 17 of them. There are 7 for each of the program offices, like our office, which is Land and Emergency Management, for the Office of Water, Research and Development, Air, et cetera. And then each of the regions has their own implementation plan. So there are actually 14, but we found there were a lot of parallels between them, and that's a good thing. A lot of the activities we have underway are consistent and map out well against each other. But there are basically some guiding principles in the adaptation plan. One of which, of course, is to prioritize the most vulnerable sites, and that's one of the areas I discussed earlier. In some of our training, that's what we're helping our RPMs understand, whether or not their site is most vulnerable, and that's the place where we want them to invest more time and resources in putting in place those mitigated measures. Another guiding principle is using the best science available. Of course, that's consistent with the CISA concept from the executive order, and we'll briefly describe some of the efforts we have underway there. But basically, all of these efforts are going to be subject to agency and program budget constraints. And of course, we'll see what happens with the new administration, but we have always had those in place, so we're learning to work with those. So how we work within those and how we prioritize is more the type of stuff that Ann is going to cover. So I'll hand it off to Ann.
Okay, great. Can I go to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you have control already?
I don't have control. Do you have control?
Nope, you're getting control right away.
Okay. Well, hi there. This is Ann Dailey, and I'm happy to be here today to follow on with Carla's excellent introduction. Hopefully, we're going to get to the next slide. Lauren, can you? Okay.
There you go. I don't know if it was me or you, but there you go.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. So, I mean, the good news is, given the context that Carla gave us, the good news is that Superfund already has an excellent process for considering climate change in building and management of resilient remedies, and we're going to explore this next. That's the next slide up. So the changing climate, depending on whatever is going on at the site, should be considered throughout all phases of Superfund. And through the next few slides, we're going to consider where climate change adaptation fits in the Superfund remedial process.
I like to point out that given the wide range and variation in locations and site conditions and considerations, the process of considering adaptation measures is most effective through use of a site-specific strategy. Okay, let's see. All right, perfect. Because I think folks are familiar with the remedial investigation and feasibility study, or RFS, process, which often kicks off the Superfund.
I want 2 slides ahead.
Oh, sorry. We'll go back one here. There we go. Okay, that's one. Okay, so in an RFS, it's important to consider, for example, when you're assessing the nature and extent of contamination and the associated risks, to be considering climate change, and also in developing and updating a conceptual site model for the site, to be aware of climate change considerations on the current data. For example, is it a 100-year floodplain? Maybe it was a 100-year floodplain and now conditions are different. Maybe it's a 50-year floodplain. And also when you're evaluating the remedial alternatives as part of your feasibility study. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide. And while it's always important to use the best available data and models, it's especially important when you're considering climate change aspects, given the rapidly changing state of the science. It's really important to make sure you have the most recent data sets and using the best models that are available. And I just also like to point out that it's really important also to check with the local and regional experts to see if they might have updated information. Just as a case in point, there is an example with a Superfund facility located near Norfolk, Virginia, where the RPM learned that a local port authority had recently updated analyses of flood and storm surge risk in the water body nearby, and they were able to use that information in conjunction with the port authority that resulted in raising the elevation of the containment wall by several feet to ensure that those contaminated materials were safe in the face of changing conditions. Okay, then when you get to remedy selection, moving on from your feasibility study, where hopefully you have updated data, again, it's important to ensure that you've got the best data, and have there been changes in the data that you might want to consider. And it's also important to note that in selecting the remedy and the remedy alternatives evaluation, that it's appropriate to use the Superfund 9 criteria evaluation, and particularly the balancing criteria of the long-term effectiveness and permanence, short-term effectiveness, and implementability. As we've mentioned, that consideration should be given during looking at exposure, remedy vulnerabilities, and adaptation measures. And as part of the 9 criteria evaluation, you might consider some factors such as the complexity and scale of the site, anticipated duration of the remedial operation. How long is the site going to be there? Are they going to be operating a groundwater system for 5 years or 100 years? Is there going to be a landfill in sight for forever, basically? And what's the situation with the existing infrastructure nearby in the community, the roads, the power system, the water supplies? What things you need to consider to make sure that your remedy continues to operate well. For example, after Sandy, much of the state of New Jersey power for a significant period of time that affected some Superfund cleanups. You also make sure that there's the primary backup means access to the site if the road gets wiped out or whatever. Consider future land use and development and how that may affect it. Also thinking about anticipated cost effectiveness and longevity of the potential measures of the cleanup technologies that may have in place. Next slide. Okay. So then post-construction is also another important component. We went past remedial design. There we go. Back to remedial design. So remedial design, there are a lot of remedies that are in place, and they're maybe doing remedial designs for sites. And so it's really important to consider climate change during remedial design. It's much cheaper and easier to build consideration into the design when you're at that stage rather than retrofitting later. So as part of the remedial design, it's important to consider the below ground components, the at and above ground components. site operation and infrastructure, as well as long-term stewardship. And the 3 fact sheets that Carlos mentioned, and he'll highlight a little bit later, we also go into these aspects in those fact sheets. So that's something to perhaps take a look at later if you haven't already seen those fact sheets. And then sites move into post-construction. So about 70% of Superfund sites across the country have at least one remedy that's in place and operating. So for existing remedies, there should be a periodic evaluation of potential site vulnerabilities and monitoring of the effectiveness of measures already taken, and then also incorporating any newly identified options or information into the adaptation strategy. We'll talk about one of the case examples, has just a good example of that with a drought situation. And just as an example, there may be an updated floodplain map that had originally had a site at a 500-year floodplain, but perhaps now the area is classified as a 100-year floodplain, or perhaps extreme drought is occurring and it's dropping the groundwater levels that can be a factor as well. And folks are probably familiar with the 5-year review process, and there is a factor within the 5-year reviews that consider remedy protectiveness. And for example, the protectiveness assessment question C, as in cat, is that has any other info come to light that could call into question the protectiveness of the remedy? And the 5-year review guidance issued in the 2000 addresses this, but more specifically, the new streamlined 5-year review template issued in January 2016 provides an additional focus on new information that may be related to climate change, vulnerabilities, and impacts. So we're trying to encourage remedial project managers to consider that as they're doing their 5-year reviews of sites and make sure they're taking a look at that. Okay. The Superfund strategy to assure resilience is addressed in the 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Plan that Carlos mentioned to kick the presentation off. And the Superfund strategy to ensure resilience includes kind of 3 key steps. That's evaluating site vulnerability through means of exposure assessments and sensitivity assessments, and also includes identifying current and potential impacts and then implementing adaptation measures as appropriate to ensure resilience of the remedies. And then finally, monitoring all cleanup projects and periodically reevaluating them to ensure that the existing measures are appropriate or changes need to be made. This is a simple graphic that we have in our climate change fact sheets to just essentially show the same thing. It illustrates the iterative nature appropriate for consideration of climate change impacts, and that the adaptation strategy should include monitoring of the implemented measures and periodic reevaluation of the system vulnerabilities and incorporating any changes that might be needed. Okay, so the Superfund project manager's role is recognizing that typically the in-depth knowledge of the site, the project manager has a really important role in climate change adaptation at a site, ensuring resilient remedies. And essentially, it kind of comes down to a couple of bullet points that we have here, and it's really kind of asking questions and using common sense. You've got to look around and see what's going on and make sure you're aware. The nearby Port Authority put together a new modeling that you can perhaps take advantage of. Then understanding the climate change issues in the general area and near the Superfund site, understanding the potential vulnerabilities at existing and planned sites and remedies, then implementing the adaptation measures with the recognition that more options are typically available earlier. Again, it's cheaper and easier to build it in rather than retrofit later, and then monitor and update as needed. I think back to Carlos now.
Thanks, Ann. And then we're getting short on time. I'm getting a notice here, so I may have to speed up a little bit, or at least cover less material. But I did want to cover this. This is some new material for this webinar, highlighting some of the efforts that we have underway. One of them, of course, is on the supply side, what we call the supply side, but basically it's all the consulting engineering firms that are out there working for the agency. Give them a heads up of what our expectations are, and that we will be asking for their expertise, so they should be prepared to respond to that. as we say at the end, luck favors the prepared, and that's on both sides. We're doing quite a bit of staff training on management and technical considerations. The slides you just heard from Ann, we share those, we use those a lot in our training for RPMs. As you know, there are close to 500 Superfund RPMs out there, and we've been taking some training on the road, and also been doing some internal webinars. So that's the messaging they're getting on our side, so you have some insight on that. With respect to the climate-informed science analysis, we're working with Office of Research and Development and across programs here to figure out how we can apply some case studies and what some of the best practices are out there. As Ann mentioned, we don't want to reinvent the wheel when this analysis has already been conducted at one site. We want to avoid doing it multiple times, once for the water treatment plant, once for the port, once for the highway, once for the bridge, once for the MPL site. We just need that analysis done once. So how can we share those analyses and leverage dollars invested? On the enforcement side, just FYI, EPA is considering some model language for sediment. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal expert, and I can't speak for the enforcement office, but you can think about it as, historically you might have considered, oh, this was a huge catastrophe, it was, it was an act of God. Well, now we know that the range of possible weather events is beyond what it was traditionally, and you should have been prepared, and that's not going to get you out of it. But anyway, keep an eye out for that kind of development. And finally, a lot of the outreach we're doing, I'll share with you at the end. I want to provide a little bit more information on the contract side. I just hit click, and I'll wait and see if something happens to go to the next slide. But basically, here we go. The Superfund program has a new strategy for acquisition. We invest about $500 million a year in site cleanups, and we have all types of contracts across the 10 regions. So that is being streamlined to a certain degree, and some new contracts are being put out there. Two major ones are the Remediation Environmental Services contract and the Environmental Services and Operations. Well, the RAS, for example, that second bullet, is a very large contract, and over its 10-year lifespan, it has capacity of up to more than $1.5 billion, so it's quite significant. And in the statement of work requesting proposals, there's a section under 1.4 on green remediation and climate change considerations. It's pretty straightforward. It says contractor may be requested to present approaches to mitigate impacts of climate change on remedies. So basically, it's in the scope. We told you we'd be asking for this. At the site level, the project manager will get more specific, but firms bidding on this should be prepared to answer how they will address climate change adaptation to ensure the effectiveness of remedies. So anyway, that's one of the efforts we have underway. A couple of the projects, very quickly, I won't give you all the background details, but one of them is Purity Oil Sales, the Superfund site in Fresno, California. And what happened there is that they had, it's a historic site where they used to have, it used to be an oil processing facility. There was not good waste management, contaminated soil and groundwater, which is drinking water source for Fresno. They had a very large groundwater treatment system, extraction and treatment system. And guess what? Due to continuous drought patterns in California and related increased use in groundwater extraction for agriculture, the water table dropped a lot, and that groundwater system was pumping dry, basically. What they did then is that there was an associated salt vapor extraction system. They upscaled that, and they were able to mobilize a lot of the VOCs in a much more aggressive manner and extract them much more quickly than what they were getting with the groundwater extraction system. So there, basically, they adapted the operation of the remedy, existing remedy components, in response to changing climate conditions and weather conditions at their site. The other one, and I'm not getting...
Carlos, maybe we can hold the second case study for question and answers. If you want to go to your resources now, then we can come back to the second case study.
Okay, fine. That works, Barbara. But I'm not getting a movement here.
Maybe, okay, great, there you go.
There it is. So the URL at the bottom of the page, that's the one both Ann and I are referring to, EPA.gov/Superfund, Superfund Climate Change Adaptation, the information and resources we talked about are all located there. We've got the series of fact sheets. We've got some online resources, such tools that may be used for CISA and other resources like that. And that's about all I need to cover. The other slides are self-directed and rehash some of the priorities and key points we mentioned earlier. So with that, I'll stop, Barbara, and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Carlos and Ann. And all of the slides are going to be available on the recording of this. So we'll get a chance, all of us will get a chance to see the slides again. Our next speaker is Thomas Parter with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. He has over 24 years of experience in the field of waste cleanup. He serves as the statewide Clean Energy Development Coordinator for the Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup. He's previously served on his agency's head of the agency Office Environmental Innovations team to help expand the energy environmental coordination across Mass Department of Environmental Protection programs and regions. For 10 years, he was the statewide audit coordinator for waste site cleanup. And before joining the state of Massachusetts, he worked throughout New England as an environmental consultant, primarily on sites regulated by the Mass Waste Site Clean program. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Tom holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Geography from Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. Take it away, Tom.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you, Carlos and Ann and Lauren. Let's see. There we go. So, we're not going to be talking a lot about the intricacies of remediation, only because we're just getting started here in Massachusetts. So I wanted to just lay the groundwork of how we got to really thinking critically about climate change and its impacts on our remedial programs, and show you how a state kind of moves in this direction. So for today, I'll talk a little bit about our legislative mandates that really got us started, what the climate change impacts are meant to be here in the Northeast and specifically in Massachusetts, what we are doing and getting started doing with our cleanup assessment and cleanup programs, and some newly launched executive orders and initiatives by our governor to even ramp up more. I like this slide that you're seeing right now because it really kind of shows you where we're going with climate change. Certainly if we do something, we do nothing, but the state of Massachusetts will be getting warmer, no doubt. Okay, moving forward. I'm sorry, I can't get the slide to move.
I can run them for you if you're having issues.
Thank you, Lauren. If you can get me to the mandate slide. I wanted to review the state mandates that actually came out in 2008. And the mandates were really the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is really a climate change act, and a Greenhouse Gas Emission Reduction Act, where goals were established for the state to meet to be actually by 2020 to be 25% below our greenhouse gas emission levels established in 1990 baseline, and then another goal of 80% by 2050, where we had no goals set for us in 2030 and 2040. Along with that, the Green Communities Act was passed in 2008 as well, and this act really dictated that the state move to a clean energy economy, a renewable energy economy, where we increased our renewable portfolio standard to build out more renewable energy in the state to make us less reliant on fossil fuels and more on really home-produced energy. And really they complement one another in that in trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we'll be moving to clean sources of fuel. The Act really is about mitigation and adaptation. Certainly we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and for the mitigation aspect, there was a clean energy and climate plan put together to try to pave or create the road, the framework for how to get there. In adaptation, there was a requirement that a climate change adaptation report be issued. That report would analyze strategies for adapting to the predicted impacts of climate change in the state of Massachusetts. The results of the report indicated that we are a state with 192 miles of coastline, 1,519 of tidal shoreline. That would include all of our islands, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, the Cape. And certainly sea level rise and flooding are a primary concern and impact here in Massachusetts. Extreme weather events, which we're now experiencing and seeing, would be more frequent in the future. Precipitation changes, where we'd see decreased summer and increased winter precipitation. And I can tell you that the summer already of 2016, we've seen a significant drought condition here in the state, so it should not be a surprise based on the results of this report and look into that issue. And then we would expect certainly more extreme flooding events, in shorter time frames than the 100-year, and then our temperature increases as well, which again, we're seeing, and we're certainly seeing across the globe. So those are really the impacts that we're facing and we're looking into when we start to think about how do we adapt our assessment and remediation that we conduct in a cleanup program. And here's another look at some of the factoids of some of the impacts and how things will change here in Massachusetts. We'll certainly have actually less snow days, but we will have a longer growing season, which may be good, may not. I think it's predicted that we'll probably lose our maple syrup production in the state, and that would go further north, which is big to our economy. I'll tell you that all summer we were hearing reports of the lobsters offshore. That's a big part of our fishing industry, have now moved further north, and that Maine was the benefactor of the big lobster catch this past year. So things are certainly already changing. Back in 2014, 2015, you may have heard about it. Boston was inundated with its largest recorded snowfall ever on record. So there are those extreme weather events and the increase in precipitation that was predicted that we would have to deal with. And certainly when we're talking about remediation, remedial systems, snow loads would be one of those concerns that we should be thinking about. This is just a look at what has been predicted for sea level rise and storm surge in the city of Boston. The yellow indicating a 5-foot rise, and what would it do to the coastal areas. You can see our airport there out in East Boston. And as you may or may not know, Boston itself as a city was a large part of it was filled land. So we made a lot of this land by filling in a lot of the waterways and wetlands. This is what 7.5 feet would look like, and certainly would inundate large parts of the city. And we're already experiencing during high tide, certainly with a super moon last night, that water is encroaching in our Seaport district already, and starting to become a little bit of an issue. And I got to say, the city of Boston is doing a great job planning for this and looking forward at adaptation measures. So what can a state do about climate change and adaptation? Evaluate our infrastructure. We were talking about EPA looking at all the remedial sites. We'll be doing something similar, providing technical assistance to communities, outreach, using the best science, convening stakeholders, and incorporating goals and targets into our state requirements, certainly our state laws and regulations. Based on the adaptation report in 2011, where we've got a lot going on in the state already, our Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, as you can see from this laundry list of things, what we are doing with grant programs to rebuild dams and seawalls and do armoring protection measures. I'll get into what the department, my agency, Department of Environmental Protection, is doing. Coastal Zone Management is doing a lot of work, and certainly the Department of Energy Resources, and I'll talk a little bit about a program they have for resiliency. Lauren. So I wanted to touch upon this. It may not be remediation, but it is something we're doing within the Department of Environmental Protection and our Bureau of Water Resources. We already have employed a circuit rider staff person who's looking into the impacts that our wastewater treatment plants are going to have from climate change. The drinking water and wastewater treatment facilities in Massachusetts, the wastewater treatment facilities anyways, are primarily gravity fed. So they're at low elevations already, and a lot of them are within coastline areas and shoreline areas. So we know that we're going to have to do something about those. And so we're working on evaluating the entire infrastructure and where they are. And again, resources and everything else. We're working with the Worcester Polytechnic Institute, a college here in Worcester, Massachusetts, who's now starting to focus on this issue for us. Has developed some good tools and resources that we can use so we can specifically focus on what needs to be done at these facilities. But it's one example of what we're doing adaptation-wise here in the Department of Environmental Protection. So moving on to site assessment and remediation. In our Bureau of Waste Site Cleanup, the bureau that I work in, the way the Waste Site Cleanup program works is the statutory requirement is Chapter 21E to clean up releases of oil and hazardous materials. We work under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, similar to the National Contingency Plan, to respond to and assess and remediate releases. We have a privatized waste site cleanup program. So our stakeholders are really our licensed site professionals and the regulated community. And the LSVs are really the decision makers. So we would be reaching out to them to engage their clients and the responsible parties to think about mitigation and adaptation measures as we start thinking about climate change. We have a risk-based cleanup standard, so we would integrate into that risk-based cleanup standard anything we were trying to accomplish in getting mitigation and adaptation to occur in cleanup. This is essentially our cleanup process. You respond to releases, assess them, remediate them, and then close sites. A lot of these acronyms wouldn't be familiar to if you weren't working in Massachusetts. But there's certainly opportunities for adaptation in both the remedial aspects and closures of sites and the status of those. Climate change preparedness, I'll talk to you a little bit about. And mitigation really can happen throughout the entire process, and we'll talk about that as well. So mitigation is really the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions through the legislative mandate of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And the way that that's happening already in Massachusetts is through green and sustainable remediation practices. We have been implementing greener cleanups throughout our cleanup program. It's been pretty successful. So we really kind of ticked off that box as far as climate change is concerned in the cleanup program. Adaptation is the thing we're still going to be working on to see resilience for our sites and the way they currently are within our cleanup program. One thing I wanted to mention in our emergency response, when releases are reported to the state, we obviously respond immediately to those. We have this is a picture of our FAST vehicle. But we're cognizant of the fact that those responses are going to change or certainly be different in the face of climate change. And I'll share a story that we've already had significant impacts with snow, but we had significant rain events as well in our history. We had multiple 275-gallon above-ground storage tanks in residences in this large storm event in our northeast part of the state. That were uprooted and floating all around neighborhoods and in basements of homes and everything. And this is the type of thing that you now have to learn to deal with, certainly in any large storm event, but it might be more prevalent. And what are the adaptation measures that we need to start thinking about, and we can start helping with and communicating out to folks who heat with oil and store it in that manner. This is kind of how we got mitigation going in the state, and probably the similar roadmap we used for doing adaptation is we started with a stakeholder group, our work group of LSPs, to talk about how we might get this accomplished in our assessment and cleanup programs. Then we prescriptively did regulatory amendments, placing the requirements for green cleanups to be in our regulations. Whether we do that with adaptation or not, we're still internally discussing that. Then we, of course, have guidance, so we're reaching out to folks, and then we start training people so that we get them thinking about these concepts, and we're able to get that incorporated into the cleanup programs. Back one. For adaptation, as far as regulatory changes or regulatory focuses we might make in the state of Massachusetts is we'd be focusing on reasonable foreseeable uses and the remedial action alternatives that are built into our regulations, and I'll talk about that in a little detail in a bit. But again, engaging stakeholders, and we're currently looking at evaluating our universe of regulated sites. EPA had mentioned they did an inventory. We're doing a similar inventory where we'll focus on those that we feel are most vulnerable, and those categories include our open sites certainly currently undergoing assessment and remediation, our active remedial systems on the ground operating for multiple years, engineered barriers, and institutional controls. As right now our focus. Our universe of sites is about 40,000. Our open sites represent about 10,000 sites. So you can see what we're kind of talking about as far as responsibilities that we have and to address. When I mention reasonably foreseeable uses, it's a concept that's built throughout our Massachusetts contingency plan and assessing and cleaning up sites. We ask that parties are constantly thinking about the current or reasonably foreseeable uses of a site. In other words, I think most of the time we're talking about how they'll be redeveloped or reused, but in this case, we're also going to be looking at the consideration of future impacts from climate change for those reuse options. And however they may be reused, that needs to be a consideration as well. For remedial, within our remediation decision-making and remedial action alternative is what we call it. This is when you start to identify the remedial approaches and conduct screening. There's a detailed evaluation required to compare the risks of the alternatives, including on-site, off-site risks posed over the period. I would see that as climate change, its impacts, and how that would play into decision-making, into what remedy you're going to select, and how you might adapt that remedy to be resilient. As far as what options... Hello, Barbara?
Hi, Tom. This is, if you can summarize this slide, and then we can go back during question and answer if we have time.
Okay.
Stuff. Thank you.
So we're just looking at what our adaptation resilient measures might be. Right now, just thinking out loud, we had a primary objective of using renewable energy, so we see that as an obvious option, and an on-site power is a new one. And are there incentive programs available for those? In 2014, unfortunately, this program is closed. There was an effort by our Department of Energy Resources, a resiliency initiative to adapt, and this is a lot for municipalities to be resilient. So talking about those wastewater treatment plants, where a similar program were to come out in the future could be applied to remedial systems, and or some of an existing program would work as well. Just some examples of what those resiliency measures were: microgrids, backup power, and making, again, wastewater drinking water treatment plants resilient, how the money was dispersed, the $40 million that we had initially back then, and hopefully we'll have in the future to apply to projects. We like wastewater drinking water treatment plants. We engaged the Worcester Polytech students. We've engaged the Boston University students to look at the waste site cleanup universe of sites and to identify where impacts might be for flooding, in particular the 105-year flood. So they took on that initiative, looking at our northeast region of the state. Believe it or not, they used Google Earth, and Google Earth has 105-year flood maps, and they were seeing, you can see here, they mapped the sites where we had active remedial systems that might be vulnerable. And similar to the map that I showed you, the city of Boston, this is again the impacts from a 100-year flood, which would be, you can see we have some petroleum storage refineries, our airport, and this is a very industrial part of the city. And then 5 years, same thing, a 500-year would reach out even further, as you can imagine. So they started to put together that work for us so we can identify where our concerns would be. Moving on, in 2016, we were looking at how we were complying with the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Tom, I'm going to just stop you there, and if we have a minute, we can go back. So I think we just have 2 minutes left to the webinar, and I just wanted to. We haven't gotten any questions from the audience, but let me just quickly summarize if you can pull my slides up, Lauren, on the SURF Technical Initiative. We introduced this technical initiative earlier this year and on the webinar, and as you heard from our panelists today, there's a lot going on at the federal level and the state level, and we will be building on those efforts, doing a site conceptual model, looking at the redevelopment impacts and interests, case studies that go into the SURF case study initiative and the National Adaptation Forum Climate Adaptation Exchange. We'll have a white paper at the end of 2017. The next slide is just, I wanted to highlight the next slide highlights one of our team members' work, Haruka Weinwright from the Department of Energy, and Carlos on the vulnerability sites, Tom in Massachusetts, the sea level rise, the importance of long-term monitoring, and they're working on a 21st century program to reduce monitoring costs by 50%, and this has application to the sites that we heard about today. So we'll just go, and it has the next slide, Lauren, will tell you other. We'll just go to the end to other sites, including Fukushima. Haruka is working with the researchers there where groundwater changes very quickly. We'll end with our last slide, which is the next slide. We share this vision. We've had some talk about providing value to communities, and Tom and Carlos and Ann, thank you for your work on cleaning up sites and ATMs for local communities, just as the Bright Hills program in Massachusetts. And we haven't gotten any questions from the audience, but we welcome you to share your ideas, contact and join our team. Our next team meeting is December 2nd, and there's our address. And thank you, panelists. So much information. Thank you. So it'll be available to the audience shortly on the EcoAdapt webinar. And I guess the closing steps are do join our climate change and resilience team, but also submit a proposal for the National Adaptation Forum in May of 2017.
And also mark your calendars. We have another webinar coming up on Tuesday, December 13th. That will be focusing on, oops, I'm sorry, I misspelled adaptation. I wrote that quickly. Adaptation in post-election America. We'll have federal agency, state, tribal, and foundation panelists to discuss how their work will be affected. And we will send out an email with all of the links to the slides and the recordings once they're all up online. Back to you, Barbara.
I think we're out of time, but we thank you all for your participation. Feel free to email us with any of your questions, and we can respond to them in the recording. And thank you, Ann, Carlos, and Tom for sharing your expertise. And definitely, there's a great. We hope to leverage your work in the future. Thank you again.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Barbara.